Welcome to Everything is a Primary Source, the Back to the Future trilogy of podcasts. Each week we get in our DeLorean and go up and down the timeline to different periods and analyze their popular culture, much the same way Dustbusters and sports almanacs receive scrutiny to learn about the time period that produced them. This analogy is actually perfect for today's episode, as Dustin Regec, who hosts the wonderful Instagram account Recycled Architecture, is here to talk about his favorite movie, Back to the Future Part 2, and how it stands as a document of its time, 1989. Just like the scene from the movie I was alluding to with the 2015 antiques dealer showing Marty McFly items from the bygone era of the 1980s and using them to explain daily life, then we're going to spend some time doing the same with the movie itself. Stay tuned after our discussion because I have a segment recorded from this past June when I spoke with Kevin, a college professor and member of the Society for Commercial Archaeology, during that group's annual conference in Erie, Pennsylvania. He and I discussed the group's trip to Kinzua State Park, a site that is straight out of the Back to the Future trilogy. But first, just in time for Back to the Future Day, October 21st, here's Dustin and I talking Back to the Future Part 2. So, recycled architecture, you were saying when you're going down the road, it's like you see something that you're like, that definitely was. I always think there's like an Onion headline that I remember from years ago. It was like, bank obviously used to be a Taco Bell or something like that. But it seems like Pizza Hut's like the one that gets converted the most.
Yes, Pizza Hut, because it seems like Pizza Hut, the places that will go in and recycle a Pizza Hut, they don't do that much change to it. They'll maybe paint the roof, but those windows are so recognizable, and obviously the roof. I like the more creative ones. And
it's like, I because of your Instagram, I've looked at the world totally different than that. Like when I drive, I do, because I'm like, and it is the ultimate definition of pop culture, because throughout the United States, especially, we all have, these buildings that were put up maybe at most 60 years ago. A lot of these franchised, very recognizable from the roadside, from the road structures. We're like, that's a McDonald's, that's a Friendly's, that's a. What would you say is like, because you get submissions from all around the country. What do you think was like the most clever, or like, what was the most interesting one that you ever got?
From somebody else, I'm trying. I found it on someone else's Instagram, and I asked them if it was all right to repost it. It was a Pizza Hut that had been turned into an adult bookstore.
Oh, right. The one that was like New Mexico or something, right? Yeah. So Pizza Hut, I think, is a great segue to our topic today, because I have distinct memories of the marketing just extravaganza surrounding our topic, which is Back to the Future Part 2, through the way of Pizza Hut. So like the Pizza Hut that I would go to around 1989 when the movie came out was like, they got rid of all those black and white pictures in between the tables of Italy, and replaced them with pictures of the flying cars and 2015 Hill Valley. And I thought that was, and you could get the sunglasses there, like you could buy the different kinds of sunglasses that the future would wear, and as part of your meal experience. And I really thought that was the cleverest way to market for a movie, because it wasn't like they had posters all over. It was just very subtle. It's like, yeah, here's some pictures of, the not so distant future. And I thought that was so interesting way. Of course, I mean, there's so many other ways that they marketed. One thing they didn't do, as far as I could tell, is not a lot of like action figures and toys. Like Back to the Future Part 2 didn't really have those to accompany, unless I'm overlooking something.
The only ones I can distinctly remember, because I remember getting them at like a dollar store in Florida on a trip, is they made like micro machines of the DeLorean, the police car from the future and the taxi cab from the future, and a little play set of the future Texaco.
Oh, okay.
But that's it.
That was cool. Yeah, they didn't really, because I feel like if the movie had come out 10 years later, they definitely would have had action figures of all the characters,
Oh yeah.
because they were kind of like doing that in the late 90s with, it was like action figure overload for a while. But, we were, and that might even speak to the intended audience. So what we do on this show is we treat things like movies, in this case, Back to the Future Part 2, as artifacts, documents of the past, just the same way as something you'd find in a museum. So we have a template similar to what a curator at a museum would use to identify an object that they have and tell something about it to visitors. We do the same thing for movies. So we break it down with a number of questions, and that's going to be our conversation for today. The first question that comes up when it comes to any document is, including a movie, is what material was it made from, how is it made? And with a sequel, it's pretty obvious what the original material is, and that's the original movie, Back to the Future, 1985's Back to the Future, which has a very short scene at the end, which, audience members kind of saw as like, oh, they're definitely going to make a sequel of this because of the way the original movie ends. But my understanding is that was not necessarily the intent. They just kind of left it there, maybe. And when they went to write the movie, Bob Gale and Bob Zemeckis were not in love with the idea of where that movie left off. What is your take on that? As like in 1985, do you think that they were definitely going to have a sequel, a second one?
Oh no, I know. I mean, they had no intention of making a sequel. They, in fact, like the To Be Continued, they only did that for the home video release. In the original theatrical showing of the movie, it did not have To Be Continued. It wasn't until it was released on home video that they had thought that they were going to make a sequel. I've read that a few places. I've done some deep dives on Back to the Future too.
Yeah. Well, it's I guess it says something about and I don't mind skipping ahead just a little bit to the question of who's the intended audience, because that in that era, VHS was always at least like a 6 months differential from when the movie came out in the theater to when it was released on home video. And so the audience in the theater probably, they definitely loved the movie, but there was some time in between. So I didn't know that component of it, that the To Be Continued part wasn't added to the end, where I'm sure the decision was made based on the feedback they got from box office revenues. Like, okay, this thing is much bigger than we thought it was going to be. Let's make a sequel out of it. But then they got stuck with that little. It was supposed to be kind of a throwaway scene, right? With Doc coming back from the future and, bring her along too. He was adamant about that. And then they're like, oh, crap, now we got to write in a Jennifer storyline.
Well, and I think I want to say it was Bob Gale. I'm not sure which of the Bobs it was, but one of them definitely said if they had planned on making a sequel, they wouldn't have put Jennifer in the DeLorean with them. Because you see how quickly into the future she's like essentially taken out from that story. Not taken out, but I mean they put her to sleep.
Minimize her.
She does come back,
yeah.
but not right. Yeah, and it's not the same actress either.
Right, which I mean that, and same thing with Crispin Glover. It's like that. I know the reasons why the two actors didn't come back are totally different. The original Jennifer, it was because of an illness in the family that she had to take care of, and so they brought in Elizabeth Shue for that. But with Crispin Glover, it was, I need more money because, he was, I don't think his age difference was all that great from Michael J. Fox. Like, he was in that group of young actors as well and saw the movie as his springboard to great fame. I've seen interviews with him before about the lawsuit that he brought because I guess they used, against his permission, a face mold to make a mask for the actor that took over the role of George McFly to look like him. And he's like, you can't use my likeness without my permission. And I think that was like the beginning of him getting a reputation in Hollywood of being kind of an oddball. But when I've heard him speak about it, I'm like, no, this guy seems like has a legitimate argument as to why you can't use your face. I mean, it's getting so hard nowadays with AI and you know, all the deep fakes and stuff. But in the 80s, I mean, it was like a new thing.
He won that lawsuit. He did.
Yeah.
He did. They had to pay him for using his likeness, but he wanted $1 million and script approval to be in Back to the Future 2.
Which they're like, the star is Michael J. Fox, right? Like, it's not you. People aren't flocking to the theaters to see, Crispin Glover. But I think he saw it as, kind of like a, almost like another version of the Brat Pack kind of thing. Like all these young actors, him and Michael J. Fox and Leah Thompson, and I guess even Thomas Wilson as being kind of this, these young actors who were presenting such a sweeping epic of a story, which that idea of being a sweeping epic really picks up with part 2. Because the interesting thing is that how is it made? They were making part 3 simultaneously with part 2, which I think is kind of wild. For the time. Nowadays, that seemed I'd say about 10 years ago, that seemed to be the norm. They were taking these big movies and filming multiple sequels at once so they could release them one after the other. But for the late 80s, Back to the Future was kind of, they made themselves a franchise overnight by making the 2 sequels back to back. Where does part 3 rank with you? Do you like part 3 close to how much you like part 2?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, I enjoy the movie, but my God, no. 2. It's my order is 2, 1, and then 3. I'll watch 3 if it's on TV, third. But I will not seek out 3. Yeah,
yeah.
It has some moments,
I feel like,
but no, it is not anywhere near.
Because another part of the material of making, this kind of movie, it's a time travel movie. And I feel like every storyteller that does a time travel story has a different set of rules that they go by. Can you actually, and in part 1, it always kind of bothered me when, this brilliant scientist was like, or go back and see the birth of Christ. And, he goes December 25th. And I'm like, well, so, first of all, that didn't happen on December 25th. But if you were to go back in time, you're not going through time and space, like, or see the Declaration of Independence. I'm like, okay, so you'd end up in Hill Valley, California in 1776. You have to drive across the entire continent, right. Yeah, and you do need roads in that time period. And it's like, so the rules are for Back to the Future is that this DeLorean can go through time, but it can't go through space, which I understand now even more so why your Instagram is what it is, because there's a lot of recycled architecture in the Back to the Future series where they go back and forth to Hill Valley in different timelines, and the same buildings used for different purposes throughout. But that's like the rules of time travel for Back to the Future seems like, I don't know, they kind of throw them out the window with 3. They get fast and loose with it, and it's like, oh yeah, everybody in Marty McFly's family line has married the same looking woman. Like, that's so lame.
Well, what you were saying about, like, I really did think about how in the movie how much I loved the recycled aspect of it, because if you watch, like, they're building the courthouse in part 3, and then it's all nice and new in part 2 in the original movie in the 50s, and then in the future it's a mall, which is I don't know, maybe they weren't so good with the future, because in 2015 I don't know how well a mall is doing in downtown Hill Valley.
It was fun when October, was it the 22nd of October that they 2015 is when Marty 21st. Arrives?
Yeah, it was Wednesday, October 21st. Okay.
And I remember that day distinctly because everyone's like, "Oh, it's Back to the Future Part 2 day." And we have ourselves an opportunity to see how well they, we're matching up with the present. And I love visions of the future as a way to those in themselves are almost like documents of their own time, because you can only work with so much. Like in 1988, that looked like, I think most people agreed, like, yes, flying cars will be part of our future. But, that hasn't taken off, literally. And they're like, oh, but, they must have had so much fun in designing 2015, because some of it kind of has come to fruition. Like, the way we're communicating right now. And
exactly.
I know that it's coincidental that the picture just dropped, but like that is exactly how I think everybody agreed from the Jetsons onward. They're like, yeah, when we talk to on the phone, it's going to be over, video. Excuse me. But I think that's what really drove the movie. Was that segment, which when you look at the whole film, it's actually a pretty short amount of the movie is spent in the actual future. But what do you think about, as far as like, what about the future do they get right? And what about the future do you think they were way off with?
All right, so first off, my cousin and I went and saw it again in the theater on October 21st, 2015. And they did add what I really liked was they had a special introduction from Christopher Lloyd dressed like Doc Brown. And I think he said something to the effect of like, some things happened in the future with hoverboards or whatever, so I had to go back in time and make sure that they didn't invent them. And there was like a quick preview for Jaws 19. But in terms of things they got right, I mean, like you're saying, video conference calling, absolutely. What about paying with things with your thumb, or just paying with things with an electronic device? That was definitely on point. But I haven't rehydrated a pizza recently, but
right.
But
having multiple channels that you can look at once, that seemed pretty accurate.
Yeah, that absolutely. It's funny if you look at the scene where they go in the antique store, and like I like there's a nice inclusion of like the Roger Rabbit puppet, since they were since he had made Roger Rabbit as well. But if you go to an antique store, those are the kinds of things you see there. I mean, I don't know if I've seen a dustbuster at an antique store, but you do see stuff from like this. I had this in the 80s in an antique store now. So, so that part they definitely got right. Or what about
and the way that the antique dealer treats him and talks about things is very accurate to the way we treat those things now too.
The in the Cafe 80s, there's not a person working. I think I read online somewhere that a McDonald's just opened up without an actual human employee there.
And that's like, I think they did a pretty decent job in that movie with making it look pretty well lived in. Because I think a lot of times when you get something super futuristic or space agey represented movies, they make the mistake of like, it looks like it arrived for everybody at that moment. But, like the Cafe 80s scene, they do a nice job of showing people just kind of like going to this place, and it's not like overly busy. There's like maybe half a dozen people in there already, and it's just like, it's just one of many choices we have for a meal. If they, and I remember learning when, because remember the age of DVDs when you can watch like a director's commentary segment. When I was watching for part one, they said when they were populating 1955 Hill Valley, they made sure that they looked at statistics at any given time in, since the automobile age began, only like maybe like 10% of the cars on the road are late model. Like almost everything else is at least, a decade old or more. And so that's why you don't see a lot of like brand new 1955, Chevys driving around. And then the same thing when they populate the 2015s, like you see like advertisements for getting your traditional car to be, like the DeLorean has been, augmented so it can actually fly. That they understand that not everybody just one day said, all right, now is the age of flying cars. We're going to go out and, now that Cafe 80s place is open. Let's go eat dinner or lunch or whatever. It's just kind of like this. They do a nice job of just kind of showing that he's been plopped into a world that's been active since he left, 25 years before.
Yeah, Goldie Wilson III will hover convert your old road car into a Skyway Flyer for only $39,999.95. But yeah, no, I that is one of the aspects of the movie that I enjoy so much, and like there's a lot of little Easter eggs in those future cars. Like I think the car from what's that movie, Last Starfighter, it's in the background. The car from Blade Runner is in the background. When they go, and it's like real, like blink if you'll miss it. Like I think when they go to Hilldale, where Marty lives in the future, the spider car from Blade Runner is in one of the car. It was in one of the driveways, but it's repainted, so neat. Like you don't see it as a police car. It's like and I've only noticed that because I think I had the Back to the Future 2 trading cards when I was a kid. And I was like, wait, that car looks super familiar. And then only since like the internet was I like, oh, okay, that is why it looks so familiar.
Because on the one hand, it's like they were maybe trying to send signals to us and, add those little Easter eggs in there. But on the other hand, it's like that's what movie making was in that time period with actual practical props. It wasn't CGI, that they just were pulling from what they had access to on the lot. And actually, it's a perfect way to bring it up because I know that the set designer or the art director or whatever for the movie wanted to interpret the future differently than say Blade Runner had, which sadly Blade Runner is actually a little bit more accurate as far as what things look like in the 21st century. But it was like, okay, that gave us a dark, very, kind of pessimistic look to what the future looks like. Hill Valley 2015, if we take that trajectory that, they were on when the first movie left off, it looks a lot more hopeful, looks a lot more bright and optimistic, which is not something that would happen a lot in the 80s. I think that visions of the future traditionally in the 80s or so seem to be kind of bleak, whereas this movie changes that and makes it look shiny and promising. The one thing I always got really annoyed with is the way that Biff has returned to his nasty ways. Like I always thought it was fun in the original movie when you see him, waxing the cars and everything like that. And he's like, oh, yes, sir. He's all meek and everything. I'm like, oh, finally he learned his lesson. And then when they show him, at the very beginning, he's like, something's going on here. And it's like his darkness returns. I'm like, no, I like it when people are reformed for good. But that really drives the story, though, is him turning into, old mad Biff again. What do you think about Biff's direction for the second one?
He definitely becomes an angry old man. And it drives the plot of the movie when he like puts two and two together when like Marty's son wakes up and runs out and he's like, wait a minute, two of them? And then what I was thought was like, and it even bothered me as a kid watching the movie. I'm like, how did he figure out how to get in the car and get it to go through time? And then it's not like he's like a able-bodied, like running around guy. He's an old man. He has to hide that car somewhere on the outskirts of Hill Valley because whenever he goes through,
right,
he's not in town. And how's he going to get into town? I guess that's things you're not supposed to worry about as a viewer. But even as a kid, I was like, how'd that work out?
Well, and I think that's what makes the third one kind of weak because they get even, I hate to say it, but lazier with those kinds of dynamics. Like, just those little details that made the first one so great are kind of lost by the time they're making the third. And that might have everything to do with the simultaneous creation of the two sequels, that they're like, well, we have to, we're going to have to make some, cut some corners somewhere. And one of them will be, we don't have to explain how Biff learned how to activate this, one of a kind time machine device thing and make his way all around, the circuits of time.
And I know that because I was always confused as a kid when he comes back to the future and it looks like he's like having a heart attack. And I remember seeing on like a deleted scene, he like erases from existence because they said that he he doesn't live till 2015 in the new timeline that he creates. Is
Right.
what is how I was to understand that, but they didn't do a good job of explaining that.
Right. It just like looks like he's an old man having some kind of incident, and you're not really and it's kind of a shame that, I mean, again, it's a fantastic movie. It's so much fun, but that it kind of takes the fan to do their own research to find out and like listen to those commentaries and read up on articles and be like, oh, that's why they were doing that. Because at the same token, I don't like it when movies over explain to me, and they feel like I'm too dense to figure out, and put two together. So it's like, okay, now that I rewatch this over and over again, and given the time period in which this movie came out, the video rental age, they knew people were going to be watching it over and over again, and not just, like, oh, I saw that once, that's enough. They're going to keep going back and analyzing it. And, speaking of going back, that I think is one of the coolest things about Back to the Future Part 2 is that it's, I think it's the first movie to ever revisit its original. Like, I can't think of anything else before that. I know other movies since then. I remember the director and the screenwriter saying that there are some super fans who claimed that if you watch the original Back to the Future, you can see Marty in his trench coat hiding in the back of the parking lot at the dance scene. I'm like, and they're like, no, because we didn't think to make this movie until afterwards. But it's like that's the kind of like thinking that only a movie like that could bring up, because it's like it's so cool that. Because I heard that originally they wanted to set the when they go back in time to the 60s and do kind of like a late 60s Flower Child kind of motif, but they're like, hey, we have an opportunity here to do something that no other movie series has done. Let's go back to the original storyline, just look at it from a different perspective. I think that was like the coolest thing.
I can remember as a kid, like when that I have the most distinct memory of seeing the commercial for it, and they're showing like the dance, and then you see it from the ground up, and you can see Marty on like the catwalk above, and I was like, what is happening? What is going on? There's two Martys. Like, yeah. I had to see that movie. And a quick little side story. So when that movie came out in '89, I'm in school. My dad shows up, and he's like, yeah, I need to take Dustin. He has a doctor's appointment. And I was like, doctor's appointment? And we went and saw Back to the Future too. It was still one of the coolest things my dad has ever done. Yeah. Yes.
That is so cool. That is awesome, actually. I love that. And it's like, and you technically did, because Doc Brown is a doctor, so you had an appointment to see Doc Brown. So it's not a lie. That is awesome. So it's like that. I think it all kind of fits into the time period, that the care that it went into. So when it comes to who made it, I mean, we could list off all the actors because they were definitely part of it. But I think when it comes down to it, you have Bob Gale and Bob Zemeckis, the two Bobs, who, what was their status in Hollywood by that point, would you say? Like, how recognizable? Because I think now, after they have, like, especially Bob Zemeckis, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Castaway, Forrest Gump, under his belt, that his name is up there with like the Spielbergs and Nolans and all these great actors or directors of our era. But in the time of Back to the Future Part 2, when they were developing this film, how recognizable do you think, what was their status in society?
Well, I think before the internet, people really didn't know all those names like that. Like, sure, you knew like Steven Spielberg and such, but I feel like sometimes people didn't even like, you would watch the end of the movie and be like, oh wait, that is the guy who directed that other movie I liked. But like, it wasn't as. I mean, maybe that was just, I was 9 in 1989, so I don't know. But I think people are way more aware of following a director now than they were then.
Yeah. Well, because they had to go as far as, I think, like, Spielberg was the name of the 80s because of all those big movies that he had made. So much so that they made a big deal out of him being the producer of Back to the Future. Like, that was a thing, and Goonies and a couple others where they just like kind of used his name, sort of like how Tim Burton's name with The Nightmare Before Christmas. He had nothing to do with that movie other than like the basic idea for it. But, they just use it as a way to tell people like, okay, this isn't just some other science fiction adventure movie out there. This is a Spielberg, kind of like he gives his blessing on it. And, it's going to be good because he's involved in some way. Whereas, like, just a few years later, you could actually just say it's a Bob Zemeckis film. And you're right. Like, people would be like, oh, yeah, that's the guy who did all these other movies. I think it's going to be good.
Right. Yeah. It's weird how things have, and I think even nowadays, it doesn't even matter. Like, the way people consume movies is so different now. A lot of times people, like, when that movie came out, I was like, I need to see this, like, immediately, day it comes out. And nowadays it's like, oh, I can wait, or it'll be on demand in 3 months or less.
Yeah, you absolutely like weigh out your options when it comes to a movie a lot more than we did in those days. Like, this was Back to the Future Part 2. I didn't have anybody pluck me from school for it, but I do remember distinctly going to see it, and it was in the same theater that I saw the movie Twins, which aesthetically they kind of have some similarities as they came out around the same time, of like the colors and everything. I was just kind of like, when I was younger, I kind of confused the two because I saw them in the same theater, not terribly far from each other as far as time. And I'm like, oh wait, when's the part that those guys get killed for stealing? Oh wait, that's not this movie. That's
a different movie.
But Julius. But yeah, it's like that kind of thing. And so that, I think that you're absolutely right about that. In the 80s, we didn't have the structure of networking that IMDb eventually gave us, that we could be like, okay, if you liked, it's like, we know maybe we have room in our lives for like one director and that's it. Steven Spielberg, king of the 80s, he makes all these great movies then, and 90s for that matter, Jurassic Park, biggest movie of the 90s probably. But, attaching his name to things was the way that you would get people to the theater, because otherwise it's who knows, this time travel movie, it's ridiculous. I've been watching, just starting like a couple days ago, the series Outlander. I don't know if you've ever seen that one. It's based on a book series, and it's also about time travel. But what's fun about it is that it's a time traveler from 1945, and she just slips through, like, kind of inexplicably, 200 years into the past. And so it's fun because it's not a modern one. It's not like in the Back to the Future movies where it was taking place in the 80s and we got to see an 80s teenager. It's like, here we have somebody that's not even from our time, so she doesn't have all of the knowledge of computers and, television even. It's just all 40s stuff that she carries back with her to the past. But it's a pretty good series. They seem to have, I mean, it's definitely not science fiction like Back to the Future is, where there is a science component to it. Like, as junk science as it may be, it is, the flux capacitor is the explanation as to how it all works. It's not as simple as like, say this, say this line 3 times and you'll be transported. It's like, no, you have to use this specific machine to get to and fro to the future. So far in the series, and I could, listeners might be like, oh, you screwed up with this. But so far in the series, it doesn't seem like much of what she does in the past has any effect on the future. and that's what I really love about from the beginning of this Back to the Future series, how even the most minor change, and like Doc is adamant about this with Marty, is like nobody should know about their own future because even the slightest change could have cataclysmic, it could be unraveling the entire story of the universe, and then doubles down on it in the second one, and how it's like, no, you cannot or you shouldn't mess with things because you can end up sending like this, the slightest ripple effect can cause terrible outcomes later on, and the second one does that a lot. Do you think that is something that was a valuable message in that time period as we're heading into the 90s and all these new technologies were showing up seemingly daily? We were into that computer age. We were into, a lot of, life was moving a lot faster. Do you think that was an important message for the time period of like being mindful of what you do because you don't know how far reaching your what you do can affect people?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think it's a silly science fiction movie, but it definitely hammers the point home where like what you're doing now is going to have an effect on what happens in the future, as like small as it may be. Like I do try to somewhat live my life like that, thinking, okay, like even just with my own children, like, okay, try and tell them stuff like, okay, it doesn't take any extra time to be nice. So I know, we were, I mean, it's like a silly thing. We were at the movie theater the other week seeing, I don't even remember what we went to see. Let's say Ninja Turtles. It doesn't matter. But we were sitting in a row that had, it had 4 seats, and there was only 3 of us, and a group of kids came in with 4, and they were trying to find a place to sit. And I said, hey, we'll just move up a row and you guys can have this row. That way you can all sit next to each other. And they were like, oh, really? And the kid's like, why'd you do that? And I was like, because what did it hurt us? So I was like, we literally moved up one row and now they can all sit next to each other.
Yeah. And that will ideally pay it forward for those kids too, that they'll remember that. And you're absolutely right. I mean, some of the most distinct memories I have, vivid memories in my life are usually some kind of act of kindness, either directed towards me or that I witnessed and kind of carried with me. So, and built in. So I think that's hopefully what you did for those kids, is to see, that kind of thing. And, they really, in the second movie, that gets really reinforced when he goes back to 1985 and it's turned into like a war zone. And it's like, look what happens when a very self-centered person, gets this invaluable thing, which honestly, a sports almanac, which covers every single sport and every single score for 100 years or whatever, should be a lot thicker than like
very
a
small
long
print
comic book. Yeah, he's like, and like that guy has the time to, but I love that component of it. Now, but you see that play out. It's like everybody is suspicious of one another, kind of like nowadays. Everybody is looking for, reasons to be angry with one another. And it's like this all stems from this one event taking place all the way back in both 2015 and 1955, thanks to somebody's own greed and wanting to, cheat their way through, and ultimately it was Marty who had that idea.
Right.
And, Doc was like his conscience and was like, but I wonder if, just as a side note, what do you think would have happened had Marty been able to smuggle that back to 1985 without, Doc detecting it? I wonder what would have come of that.
Yeah, you hope he wouldn't have been as malicious as Biff gets, but I'm sure Doc would have figured it out. Like I like to think that he would have been like, wait a minute, and then went back in time again and stopped him from making these bets. Unless he was real low key about it, just making a couple bucks here and there just to supplement his income.
I like that, how they were able to manipulate time. And I did that one time when I was probably like 11 or 12 years old. I wrote myself a letter and I said, if time travel ever becomes possible, I promise, and I have access to it, I promise I will visit myself. And I wrote down the date and the time and everything like that and like put it away. I lost it. But I looked out my window. I'm like, okay, I don't see an older version of myself wandering around my backyard. So this one obviously doesn't work. That proves to me.
Or maybe you did, and you knew you couldn't interfere with your younger self, so you just peeked from a distance where you couldn't see your younger self.
I had binoculars, and I was like, so maybe one day I'll be in that situation. Like, oh yeah, that was the most boring thing I could have done with time travel. Was go back to 1993 and spy on some kid and get arrested. Occurred to me is like a lot of sequel series, a lot of movies that have sequels will have like little subtitles to them, or I always think like Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, Return of the Jedi, and others will just go with part 1, part 2, or just 1, 2, or 3. I wonder if there's any conversations when they were making the sequels to Back to the Future, if they were going to call it like Back to the Future 2, sliding through time, or or if they're just content with like the 3-chapter series.
It's interesting. I never thought about that. Yeah, until you just said it. I never thought about that. Yeah, it's just Back to the Future 1, Back to the Future 2, and Back to the Future 3. And that's it. And you're never getting a Back to the Future 4 as long as the Bobs are alive, they said.
Which is probably a good thing, because like we were saying before, it's the third one just kind of peters out. It has its moments, but it's overall you're like, okay, with Flying Train at the end, like I know they made the cartoon afterwards and everything, but it didn't have the I don't know, the rawness of the first one, and then the second one takes it to new levels, and it's like the third one, it's like Old West. Yeah, I'm good. We can wrap it up.
Yeah, I've seen the future. I don't need to see a Cowboys and Indians.
Mm-hmm. Especially when it's so like, I don't know. And we're not here to rip on 3. I mean, it's just, but I really do think that some of it is just, had they, do you know why they felt the need to just, was it just for expense? Because it was going to be more expensive to get all the actors back, that they said, all right, let's just do 2 and 3 all together, all one time, instead of calling them back again in a couple years?
From what I understand, it was supposed to be one long movie, and they had too much stuff that they were like, we have to make this 2 movies. It'll be too long. That's what I always heard about it. Yeah,
because when you watch them back to back, which as they're intended, a few months apart from each other, when you watch 2, you're like, oh yeah, like when Marty wanders into Biff's, hotel casino thing, and he's in the museum, and they show, it's not even the same guy, it's not the same Mad Dog, Tannen, but they show like, go back to the early days of his family, and it's like, why would they show that unless they're going to conclude it somehow with that? But
right,
it's another. So we were talking before about all the different families that have like monopolies over, the transportation, Statlers, and then like you have like the Strickland is all about the law in some form or another, and the genetics in Hill Valley must be very weird. That like only there's a lot of recessive genes. It seems like everybody looks exactly.
Yes.
And I've been noticing, I was telling you about that show Outlander I've been watching. The same thing's true there. It's like, not giving anything away, but saying like her modern day husband, he's doing research and he finds out that he has an ancestor who lived 200 years before in the same area. And when she goes back in time, she meets, and it's the same actor playing, the other guy.
Both
and
roles. Yeah.
I'm like, all right, I guess it's just a way for us to, as an audience, recognize the connection. They wouldn't be as powerful if they had in, the other versions of Hill Valley, a guy that, looked nothing like Strickland. They just call him Strickland. But I got a kick out of in the original movie. The storytelling is so good in all these movies that you don't question it until long after, until you start, like you were saying before, like the questions don't really come up. It's kind of like I think about the movie The Dark Knight and how good that is. And then like afterwards, you're like, oh, wait a minute. Like there's a lot of holes in that story. Like if Batman really doesn't want to kill anyone, why is he willing to blow up, a moving truck and slam it into, the top of an underpass? That seems kind of not like somebody who wants to try not to kill people. But it's like the weirdness of when you see Strickland talking to Marty and he's like, I know you've been hanging out with that Doc Brown guy. I'm like, what kind of weird rumor mill does this town have that, they have like a mad scientist and there's like teenage boys hanging out with him, and he's not like a jock athlete. He's like a music kid, kind of like a badass, skateboarder type, and like he's hanging out with some like scientist on the outskirts of town. Like what? Like,
oh, and not just a scientist who lives in essentially his garage because his mansion he lives in is burned down, and not once like that's never brought up how they became friends, or his parents never said, Marty, are you still? We don't think you should be hanging around with this guy. I know he has a giant speaker at his house that you can plug your guitar into, but that's kind of weird as well.
You like to go before school to, like I've played guitar, but I don't know. I'm never like 8 a.m. I'm like, you know what? I really just want to like hit one chord and then I'll be on my way. That kind of storytelling, not that the 80s didn't have lazy storytelling, but I feel like we've been lacking in that kind of complex thinking from a storyteller that produces really cool scenes like that with, the time, kind of the crossroads of time kind of thing. I was just watching the latest Transformers movie the other day with my son. I wouldn't have put it on my own. And it was the laziest storytelling. I mean, they set it in the mid-90s for no reason at all. Like, I don't know if you've seen this one. But for no reason at all, they're like, yeah, it's the 90s. And it's the same story that's been told in all these movies over and over again, where they have to get some kind of key thing or else the world's going to end. And of course, there's like, and again, for no reason at all, the main character's from Brooklyn, and he constantly talks about being from Brooklyn. And it's like, what the heck has happened to the movies? Like, if something like a Transformers movie had come out in 1989, not the cartoon one, but like an actual, live action movie kind of thing, I think some more care would have been taken, for one thing, to make a great story, as they did with the cartoon version of Transformers. But also, they would just like, people would be flocking to the theater. They'd be like, oh my God, I can't believe this. They have this great, story, and it's just like we've recycled those stories so often now, where the world is on the line, and you have, in the very last minute when you think it's all over, somebody does something that reverses everything. So yeah, Back to the Future Part 2 has its flaws, but man, they took some care in that movie. Like, they really cared about it. Do you think that the geography of it, so where it was made, considering they had 2 movie sets going on simultaneously, is that the reason why Part 3 kind of falters a little bit?
When I was a kid, I definitely thought Hill Valley was a real town. Until I found out it was just the backstage lot at Universal Studios. But that set is as much a character in the movie. And when you remove the actual set, when they're in the Old West and they're not in the exact same place, I do think it removes something from the movie. Like, it was so cool to see like the movie theater progress from the 50s to the 80s and then to the 2015s. Or even like the Texaco station, like there's a lot of great details they put in. I think like Statler, it's like Statler Ford or whatever in the 50s, and in the 1885 he's selling horses. So it's like the Statler family has been in Hill Valley transportation since the 1800s. I like those kind of details,
and I agree that it's weak for the time period, but if you hold up Back to the Future Part 3 to, unfortunately, subsequent movies that have been made, even ones not long after it, through the 90s, it still is like head and shoulders better than those. Even though ZZ Top is inexplicably in it, which is kind of like lame, but and he invents frisbee throwing, but it's like they still, it was enough attention to detail that makes it good. I do still like the way that he finds the DeLorean, and so there's like 2 of them existing, like in the cave thing. I think that was pretty cool. And how it's exactly as Doc described. Like, I love that, like, conversations through time kind of thing, I think is really a unique idea, and they do that good throughout Back to the Future Part 3. So it's like, for the time period, for 1990, it's not great, but you hold it up to the way that movies have just kind of fallen apart through the 90s into the 2000s, and definitely in the 2010s, you're like, yeah, this movie is actually fantastic compared to some of those other efforts. Movie-going audience, what other distractions did they have in the late 1980s that this movie series really had to, like...
I don't know, it's sports, like whatever was going on in sports at that time, or just other things like that. But Pizza Hut, they had that how they got in the movie was they paid, and it was like a quid pro quo, like, yeah, we'll pay you for this movie, but we want product placement in the movie. And they were very specific. They sent like pizza chefs to make sure that when that pizza came out of like the rehydrator, that it was the best looking Pizza Hut pizza you had ever seen.
It did look good. I'll give them that. It was like, and I that whole sequence, when I guess that was a huge landmark when it comes to movie making technology, was having, the Industrial Light and Magic was able to use a special camera technique that allowed for the same actor to be on screen multiple times with the different Michael J. Fox characters that he plays, which I remember even when that movie came out and I saw it in the theater and then again on home video, I was like, I feel like there's a lot of inside jokes, like a lot of like set jokes that were put into there by having him playing a teenage girl, and because they didn't do that in the first movie,
right?
Like he has legitimate siblings, and his whole family line doesn't all look like him in that time period, and it's like they were playing with it a bit more with the second one. They're like, yeah, Marty's entire family, not a single one of them takes from their mother. They're all McFlys through and through. And, but that was a pretty cool sequence nonetheless, where they were able to have him interact with himself over and over again in one room and enjoy fantastic.
Yeah, they definitely,
pizza.
that was like, nowadays it's pretty commonplace to see with CGI. It's easy to put an actor into, like in, what was the Avengers where they had to go and was it Endgame? One of them where they had to go back in time. And you see the same person in the same scene. Like nowadays, it's so commonplace, but that was like revolutionary in 1989 to be able to like clip a scene together with one actor playing three parts.
And it seemed like it was that kind of like problem solving that, again, makes those movies stand out, because they didn't need to just fall back on somebody. Oh, you got a computer, you can do it. Like they had to figure it out in a lot more, time consuming ways and things. Thinking about things that were distracting from teenagers, it was kind of funny because of that movie, once again, predicts what the teenager of the future would be like, with young Marty going about his life, and he's listening to music, and he's talking to himself, and then he gets home and he's like, put on channels 195 Weather Channel, and I'm like, that's kind of what has become. Like, they didn't predict these at all. They didn't predict the phone one bit. But the way that, and that's why I was trying, because this movie came out, if I'm not mistaken, in around Thanksgiving time, which was kind of odd, considering it could have easily been a summer blockbuster. But they wanted to make it so that the third one came out not long afterwards, so it was fresh in people's mind. It was almost like Back to the Future had to prove itself as like, no, we are the pop culture landmark of the 80s. Like, you other pretenders need to stay away, because, we know what we're doing here. We're going to be your main focal point. And that may be why because they definitely didn't release that movie in late November as a way to get Oscar nods for acting or anything like that. Which Thomas F. Wilson, honestly, he should get a lot more credit for portraying the different Biffs so well, because and I remember reading and hearing actually from Bob Gale that the alternate 1985 Biff was based in a lot of ways on Donald Trump of that era. He owns a casino. He is very egotistical. He has like paintings of himself. He surrounds himself. He's married, but he surrounds himself with women all the time. And it's like they're kind of like the prediction of what a Biff Tannen world would look like, where is like, I am the law. Like I am the like the police. I run the police. Basically, what he says. And like bikers are going everywhere, and he has this like kind of Elvis-esque, mafia, like the Memphis Mafia. Behind him is helping out with cracking skulls and stuff. It was like that was another like, I don't want to say prediction of the future that came 100% true, but it was clear that it was based entirely on reality of the 80s, like what we were seeing.
Yeah,
in the 80s as a possibility.
I've heard that as well, and you can definitely see how that works out in the movies. Well, his little mafia, it's the same three guys that were his gang in the 50s, and they do such a good job of using the same actors in various roles. Like I think his gang from the 1880s is made up of people from the other gangs, like from the future and the 80s. Like they all are like the same actors again and again, which is a
I love the future gang, especially with like the guy has all the different sound effects on him, which kind of came true, and like the girl has like this claws thing. Whenever I see, because I'm a high school teacher, so like whenever for the last couple of years kids show up to school wearing either clothes that's like kind of looks like that, or especially when they dye their hair like blue or green. I'm like, thank you for like looking what I pictured the future to look like. You know, like back when I was watching Back to the Future Part 2, you're kind of fulfilling that prediction of, you know, because like those teenagers in that movie are dressed really weird, but nobody seems to bat an eye at it. They're like, yeah, that's what they do. You know, it's just like not a big deal. But it's like when I see kids just kind of like acting that way or, you know, dressed that way, I'm like, yeah, it's pretty much what 1989, you know, set up for us. That this is going to be reality.
I remember when it came out on VHS, and I'm sure the statute of limitations is up on this. My dad definitely dubbed a copy of it for me, and I just watched it over and over again. Like there was a point where I could probably just recite the movie line for line, saying every line. Mm-hmm. But that was when even as a kid, I started noticing things that, you know, if you watch it real quick in the movie, you wouldn't notice. Like when he goes to the alternate 1985 and he's at the Biff casino and they got Biff's old 46 Ford there looking all nice with the Biff mannequin. There's a cop behind him and the cop starts lighting a cigarette. There's a tiny sign there that says smoking required. and like seeing it in the movie theater, you wouldn't, but only like watching it through like pause. And now with DVDs or just watching it, you know, online, you can see things that you would have never noticed. Or even when he's in the 50s, you know that you have to know that tunnel that he goes through, that is the tunnel from Who Framed Roger Rabbit that goes into Toontown. It's the same exact tunnel.
Oh, really? Okay, I didn't know that. That they did, and I guess with the director using kind of like that's like his baby. I guess is like, you know, that tunnel will bring you to different times and places. I suppose that's really clever.
The inclusion of little things in movies, you're absolutely right. Like it used to be a task to find that stuff. Like one of my favorite parts of any Back to the Future is when Doc Brown makes a scale model of like he makes this perfect scale model of the town, and then it's like to Marty, oh, I apologize, I didn't have time for the crudeness of it. I didn't have time to paint it.
To paint the
he makes one for Back to the Future 3 as well, I think. With a tiny like train set one, it's all I like those kind of things. Like the amount of time it took somebody to make a small version of the set, and for a scene that's maybe 30 seconds.
What kind of punctuation does the Back to the Future movies put onto the decade of the 80s? Would you period, exclamation mark, question mark?
Oh yeah, it's I mean, Back to the Future is the quintessential 80s movie. It happened mid 80s. I mean, so they filmed the first one in 84, I guess, because it came out in 85, and then the second one comes out in 89, and they filmed it all in the 80s because they filmed 2 and 3 back to back.
Right.
So yeah, even though 3 came out in I think 1990, but it's definitely if you look at like when Marty, like how excited Marty is to get that Toyota truck, or like nowadays it's like that's not that great of a truck, but I'm glad you really liked it. You know, it's all waxed up for you to take it up to the lake and everything. But but even like the house they live in is such an 80s house.
Yeah, it's such a dream of the 80s, yeah.
Right, yeah. It's like that's the house you want in the 80s. You want that driveway. You want to live on that street. And it's definitely like 80s. I think it's how old I was when I first saw the first movie, and definitely how old I was when I saw 2. That has like some, like, I'm like, that was quintessential 80s for me.
Yeah. Because there was a fascination in the 80s. I think retro, vintage nostalgia tends to go in like 30-year patterns or so. So like in the 80s, there was a lot of, you know, for the kids that didn't experience it, the teenagers, because that's where the whole story came from was, you know, the two Bobs were like, you know, every teenager was like, what would I wonder what my parents were like when they were my age. Like what, they're always nagging me about stuff as adults. And, I bet they were a lot different. They were probably a lot like me as teenagers. I want to see what they looked like and acted like. And that's how they came up with the whole story. Because he could have really gone anywhere else. I mean, all those other time travel stories of the same time period, most of them deal with things not even close to connected to, one's own personal life. But with this one, they're like, no, he's actually going to go out and meet his mom and dad, and he's going to be integral in them getting together. And it's like throughout the 80s, there's this fascination with the 50s. You can see it in lots of different ways. The fashion kind of came back. The ideas and ideals of like you said, like the American dream of the 50s had its own 80s version that was going on. It didn't hurt that the president, I always love that part in the original Back to the Future, is like, who's the secretary? Jane Wyman must be the first lady. You had Ronald Reagan, who was, like pretty much a, post World War II, holdover as president. And, the Stray Cats, like, we could just say it all right there. Like they were straight up 50s, but with an 80s edge, like over the top pompadours and everything. And it's like that fascination with the 50s, because the adults of the 80s were teenagers in the 50s. It couldn't really have happened any much beyond 1989, 1990, because once you get into the 90s, the parents of the 90s teenagers were children of the 60s, and it keeps going. It moves up and up and up and up. So it's like, if you're going to have this amazing story, so well told, so captivating, and the 50s are your, Doc says in part 2, he's like, it's almost like this date, is the nexus of the universe, of all the time. It has to be started and ended in the 80s. Like, you can't carry it into the 90s. It doesn't fit the imagination anymore.
Yeah, I literally saw a thing earlier today, and I reposted on my Instagram story because it like hurt my brain. It said if Back to the Future was to happen today, Marty would go back to 1993, and it hurt my brain.
Oh my god!
Think about it.
Oh my god, that does. Yeah. I don't like that at all. Because like the 50s just kind of like stay in place as, it's kind of like when you that actually does hurt worse than, but it, a close kind of thing that I feel is like when I listen to the oldies station and they start playing 70s and 80s stuff, I'm like, Billy Joel doesn't belong in the oldies station. Like Billy Joel, put him on classic rock, put him on, yesterday's favorites, but oldies to me is 50s and 60s only. Like that's oldies rock and roll and R&B and all that. It's like just that. But, they're like, well, the 80s were like 40 years ago. I'm like, yeah, I guess now that you mention it, I guess that is pretty old. Oh, I don't like that at all. That 93 is the same difference from us than what Marty McFly.
It's 30 years ago, and I always think, like, how is that possible? Because 1990 was 10 years ago, right? I always think that, like, 1990
the 90s were just
ago.
like the other day, yeah. Because, like, it has a 9 in it, and we have, like, zeros in it. I'm exactly the same, wired the same way, and it bothers me to no end that it's not true at all. And but it's like, I don't think that happened for people, like the youth of the 50s. The 80s everything had changed so much. I mean, I don't know if we can apply it just to the space age or Watergate or Vietnam, those kinds of major generational landmarks, that may have been enough just to make a completely different world on the other side of, the bicentennial. Just like the commercial buildings that is the subject of my guest's Instagram page, Recycled Architecture, Back to the Future Part 2's themes and images rely heavily on the world that had taken shape by the time it was made. And just like Recycled Architecture, when the movie was made, its vision for the future was being informed by everything that had led up to the present. In my discussion with Kevin, who teaches at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, we address how a series of events involving a Western Pennsylvania railroad, combined with the evolution of leisure, tourism, and memorializing, produced an attraction that looks like it jumped right off the screen of the Back to the Future movie trilogy. How you doing?
Oh, great.
I'm Eric.
How are you?
And I don't know how much background you got, if any, about what I do for my podcast, but it's not unlike what it sounds like you do, and that's to take things that are oftentimes overlooked as documents of the past and treat them like artifacts in a museum. Right. And so I usually focus on pop culture, movies, okay, TV shows, and things like that, but I broaden it to things like commercial space, and in this case, I wouldn't mind, if you don't mind, talking a little bit about Kinzua State Park, if that's something that you're willing to do.
Yeah, sure. So we're here at the SEA conference, and how the conference usually works is there's a field trip where the emphasis is on built environments, especially built environments related to commercial architecture, modernism, commercialism, pop culture, and trying to understand these relics and artifacts as if they're archaeology and presenting them into some sort of a context. So yesterday we left Erie, where we're having our conference, and we traveled on Route 6 east to Kinzua Bridge. And Kinzua Bridge was built in 1882 by the Erie Railroad as a way of moving coal out of western Pennsylvania into New York along the Erie Railroad system and into the Great Lakes. So they built this very, very high, long trestle across Kinzua Gorge, one of the dissected stream gorges on the Allegheny Plateau. And then they used it. They used it for almost like probably 75 years. They used it all the way up until 1959. They rebuilt it in steel in 1900. And then coal played out. They didn't need it anymore. And so the state took over it and made it the center of a state park. For a little while, a tourist railroad was running across it, the Kane and Knoxville Tourist Railroad. But then that played out. But as a feature in the state park, people could walk across the bridge. Well, they realized that it was aging, it was rusting. They had to rehab it and especially strengthen it against possible lateral winds that would come from a big windstorm or a tornado. And it so coincidentally happened that while they're rehabbing it for a potential storm that may come down the gorge, a storm came down the gorge, and an F1 tornado came right down the gorge, right when they're rehabbing it against exactly that kind of a problem. And I believe this was in 2003, and the whole bridge just fell over, except for the northern and southern parts of it. So they rehabbed the parts that were standing. They left the ruins in the valley, built a new visitor center, and now the attraction is called Kinzua Skywalk, where you walk out on the still standing parts of the collapsed bridge to see, the ruins of this trestle down in the valley. So it's an awesome sight. And it's now sort of like a major attraction in what's being marketed as the Pennsylvania Wilds. That's sort of tourist-oriented, nature-oriented part of north central Pennsylvania.
That is such in the way I look at things, and I'm sure you do too, considering what you do, is like looking almost like layers of time are
Sure.
being represented here, and I thank you
Sure.
so much for that background, because it's like the original reason why there was a trestle in the first place was because of, the coal industry and, moving things, and then eventually tourism. I think that the way it is right now speaks volumes about the early 2000s, about 20 years ago. Because I feel like in another time period, they would have been either, the idea would be like, let's just close it for good.
Let's close it for good, right? Let's demolish the whole thing and forget about it.
Yeah.
Right.
But because, in that early part, and it's weird to talk about 2003 like history, but, it was 20 years ago. So
right.
We can. I think, like, what does that tell you about sort of the spirit of preservation and the spirit of historical interpretation at the early part of the 21st century, where they say, let's not clean this all up. Let's actually allow people to explore it and make it an attraction.
Well, I think there's two things here, and one of it goes back long before that, and that's the fact that the state already owned it and was already operating it as a state park. So it didn't have to have a sort of a historical preservation initiative, because the state already had it. It was already a state park. So when Mother Nature dumped a whole bridge into the gorge, it was just a matter of, what are we going to do with this thing now? We were going to rebuild it. Are we going to rebuild it now? And so, kind of turning lemons into lemonade, they created the Kinzua Skywalk, but knitting it together as an attraction in the Pennsylvania wilds, that's definitely sort of a 21st century thing, where you're re-envisioning an entire region, giving it a brand name, and then having key tourist attractions that you build the infrastructure for, the visitor center, and then you promote them so that people will come up and not just see an old bridge. There's more people coming up to this Kinzua Skywalk now than ever came to visit the bridge when it was standing. Right. But they're also visiting other sites in north central Pennsylvania, Benezet, where they see the elks. Especially in the fall, people go up there and they look at the elk herds that are in Pennsylvania, is another one of these major attractions in the Pennsylvania wilds. And so that's all since 2000, this rebranding of north central Pennsylvania as a tourist destination with a lot of attractions to see, without a doubt. Now, it's just to, go ahead there. You have a question?
Oh, no, I was going to say, it reminds me a lot of, memorializing as well, like the way that things are memorialized. I remember, of course, the most changing, the biggest event that changed everything was 2 years before this was September 11th. And when they were trying to decide for the appropriate memorial, not only in Manhattan at Ground Zero, but also all over the country, and especially the Northeast, where firefighters descended on, Manhattan to help out. It was parts of the building, the actual scrap, iron was either brought to places. Very seldom was it like melted down and turned into other things. A lot of times you just see in communities, here's a beam. I think about here, because I'm in New Hampshire, and we have just near Nashua is Hudson, New Hampshire, where they have Benson's Animal Park. And it is now, it's an incredible park. It's just a nice walking tour place. But when I was a kid, it was like a zoo / amusement park. They rehabbed that entire park. It's a beautiful place. They restructured all of the cages for the animals, not for the intention of putting animals in there, but just as a nice, and a lot of money and time went into it to make it look as it did at the apex of its time. And in that same park is a 9/11 memorial that just has one of the beams standing up. And my son, has asked me when we're there, he's like, why do they have that there? And I have to explain, of course, that, some of the passengers, quite a few of the passengers on the airplanes are from New Hampshire because it flew out of Boston. But it does beg the question, like, why not just a regular statue, or why not just, what is the kind of the culture of the era to haul in a piece of the actual building itself and just put it there in the ground? It seems like it's very early 2000s mindset.
Yeah, I think you're right, and the fact that there was so much material in that building, it seemed that, ruined beams from the World Trade Center went all over the country as the centerpiece of memorials, especially for that. It was just a massive amount of material that came down, and it had to be cleaned from the site. And so I think that there was a lot of material available. And of course, 9/11 touched many, many, many lives in many, many different communities. And it just seemed to be an appropriate repurposing of the ruins of those buildings.
Please be sure to check out Dustin's Instagram, Recycled Architecture, for regular reminders of the commercial world that existed in previous eras. And while you're at it, look for the Society for Commercial Archaeology on Instagram at SCA Roadside, as they think along the same lines as Dustin. And don't hesitate to follow the _EPS_podcast while you're on the app for daily entries about history through pop culture. Also check out everything-history.com for all things related to the podcast and my humanities coaching and consulting offerings. I look forward to talking to you again next time on the EPS podcast, where everything, including Back to the Future Part 2, is a primary source.